Los Angeles shimmered under the golden glow of a late summer evening, its skyline a jagged mix of glass towers and palm trees swaying lazily in the breeze. Victor Grayson stood at the heart of it all, a man who'd clawed his way to the top of the city's elite. At 55, he was the chairman of Grayson Media, a sprawling empire of TV networks, streaming platforms, and advertising firms that raked in billions every year. To the world, he was a titan. Sharp jawline framed by silver hair, piercing green eyes that could silence a room, and a wardrobe of custom Italian suits that screamed money. His Beverly Hills mansion sprawled across acres, complete with an infinity pool overlooking the city, a garage stuffed with Ferraris and Bentleys, and walls lined with awards from a career spent dominating the media game. But Victor wasn't just rich, he was ruthless. He'd built his empire from nothing, or so he liked to tell himself, and he had no patience for anyone who couldn't do the same. Poverty in his mind was a choice, a mark of laziness or weakness. He'd grown up in a dusty trailer park on the edge of Bakersfield, scraping by with a single mom who worked double shifts at a diner. That life had forged him, hardened him into a man who believed success was the only measure of family. Love, those were luxuries he'd never bothered with. He lived alone, surrounded by staff who kept his world running smoothly, maids, chefs, a personal trainer, but no one he'd ever let close. His only loyalty was to his company, his wealth, his power. That night, Victor stepped out of the Four Seasons Hotel, his polished loafers clicking against the marble steps. He'd just sealed a deal with a major ad agency, a billion-dollar contract that would plaster Grayson Media's name across every billboard and screen in the country. A faint smirk tugged at his lips as he adjusted the cufflinks on his navy suit, the gold glinting under the hotel's lights. He felt untouchable, the kind of high that came from knowing he'd outsmarted everyone in the room. His driver, Daniel, stood waiting beside the Bentley parked at the curb, holding the door open with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd worked for Victor for nearly a decade. "Home, sir?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but clipped. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with a faded tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. A remnant of a life before he'd started driving for men like Victor. He didn't love the job, but it paid the bills, and he'd learned to keep his opinions to himself. "Yeah, let's get out of here," Victor replied, already pulling out his phone to check the latest stock numbers. The city buzzed around him, tourists snapping photos, valets rushing to park cars, the distant hum of traffic weaving through Sunset Boulevard. It was the kind of chaos he thrived in, a reminder of how far he'd come from that trailer park kid with holes in his shoes. He'd made it, and no one could take that away from him. As he moved toward the car, a small figure stepped into his path, hesitant and out of place among the polished crowd. It was a girl, maybe 17, her thin frame swallowed by an oversized hoodie that had seen better days. Her dark hair was tangled, falling over her shoulders in messy waves, and her sneakers were worn down to the soles. She clutched her arms against her chest, like she was trying to make herself smaller, but her eyes, big, hazel, and shimmering with a mix of fear and hope, locked onto Victor's. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling as she forced the words out. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Could you spare a few dollars, just for something to eat?" Victor stopped, his gaze dropping to her with a flicker of irritation. He took her in, the dirt smudged on her cheek, the frayed hem of her jeans, and felt a familiar disdain bubble up. Another beggar, he thought. Another kid too lazy to figure it out. He'd seen dozens like her over the years, hands outstretched, expecting the world to hand them what he'd had to fight for. He let out a dry laugh, loud enough that a few heads turned. "You want food? Go earn it," he said, his tone sharp and mocking. "I didn't get where I am by begging on street corners. Maybe try that instead of wasting my time." The girl's face flushed red, her eyes dropping to the ground as she shrank back. The small crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, others whispered to each other, but no one said a word. Victor adjusted his tie, satisfied, and stepped past her toward the car. Daniel's jaw tightened as he held the door, his eyes flicking to the girl for a split second before he slid into the driver's seat. "She's just a kid," Daniel muttered under his breath, too low for Victor to hear. He'd grown up in a rough part of East LA, where people didn't always have the luxury of pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. He knew what hunger looked like, what desperation felt like. But Victor didn't care. He never had. As the Bentley pulled away, Victor leaned back against the leather seat, scrolling through emails without a second thought. The girl was already forgotten, just another speck in the city he'd conquered. He had no idea that she wasn't just some random beggar, that she was tied to him in a way he'd never imagined. And that moment, that cruel laugh, was about to unravel everything he thought he knew about his perfect, untouchable life. Victor Grayson settled into the plush leather of the Bentley, the hum of the engine a soothing backdrop as Daniel maneuvered through the clogged streets of West Hollywood. The glow of his phone screen lit up his face, casting sharp shadows across his features as he skimmed through congratulatory messages from his board of directors. The deal at the Four Seasons had been a slam dunk, another notch in his belt, another zero added to his net worth. He barely registered the city blurring past the tinted windows, the neon signs and palm-lined sidewalks a familiar blur. His mind was already on the next move, the next conquest. Back at the hotel entrance, the girl Victor had brushed off stood frozen for a moment, her cheeks still burning from his words. Mia Torres hugged her arms tighter around herself, the sting of his laugh echoing in her ears. She'd heard worse. Plenty of people had ignored her, yelled at her, or told her to get lost over the past few months. But something about this man's cold dismissal cut deeper. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, like she was less than nothing. Or maybe it was the flicker of something familiar in his face that she couldn't place. Either way, she shook it off. She didn't have time to dwell on rich jerks in fancy suits. She needed to eat. Mia shuffled away from the Four Seasons, her sneakers scuffing against the pavement as the crowd thinned out. The valets and hotel staff watched her go, their expressions a mix of pity and indifference. One of them, a wiry guy with a name tag reading Carlos, leaned against the wall, lighting a cigarette. He'd seen her around before. Skinny kid, always hovering near the hotels or the tourist traps, asking for change with that quiet, nervous voice. "Tough break, huh?" he called out, blowing a puff of smoke into the night air. "That guy's a real piece of work. Don't take it personal." Mia glanced back at him, forcing a small nod. "Yeah, thanks," she mumbled, her voice barely carrying over the sound of a passing car. She didn't want to talk about it. She just wanted to disappear. The weight of the day, of every day, pressed down on her, and her stomach growled loud enough to make her wince. Yesterday's meal had been half a stale bagel she'd fished out of a dumpster behind a coffee shop. She couldn't keep going like this, but what choice did she have? Inside the Bentley, Daniel gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, his knuckles whitening against the black leather. He'd been with Victor long enough to know the man's edges, sharp, unforgiving, and polished to a shine, but watching him laugh at that girl had stirred something in him. He'd grown up with a mom who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, and he'd spent his teenage years dodging trouble in neighborhoods where kids like that girl didn't always make it out. He knew the look in her eyes. Hunger, yes, but also a kind of stubborn hope that refused to die. Victor didn't see it. Victor never saw it. "You ever think about helping one of those kids out?" Daniel asked, keeping his tone casual as he flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. He knew better than to push, but the words slipped out anyway. Victor didn't look up from his phone. "Help them do what? Sit around waiting for handouts?" His voice was flat, edged with irritation. "If they want something, they can work for it. I did." Daniel pressed his lips into a thin line, swallowing the reply that burned on his tongue. Work for it, sure. Like it was that simple when you were a kid, with no home, no family, no nothing. He'd been lucky. Found a way out through odd jobs and a cousin who'd hooked him up with a driving gig. But not everyone got lucky. He let the silence stretch, focusing on the road as they passed a row of high-end boutiques, their windows glowing with designer bags and dresses that cost more than he made in a year. Mia, meanwhile, kept walking, her steps slow and deliberate. She headed toward a quieter stretch of Sunset Boulevard, away from the glitz and the tourists. Her hoodie hung loose on her frame, the sleeves frayed where she'd picked at them nervously over months of wear. She'd learned the hard way which spots were safe to linger in and which ones drew trouble. Cops who'd roused her for loitering, or worse, guys who saw a lone girl as an easy target. Tonight, she just needed a place to sit, to think, to figure out how to make it through another day. She stopped near a bus bench, its metal frame cold against her legs as she sank down. The street lights cast long shadows, and the air smelled faintly of exhaust and jasmine from a nearby garden. Her hands trembled slightly as she shoved them into her pockets, finding nothing but a crumpled receipt from a gas station where she'd bought a candy bar 2 weeks ago. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the ache in her stomach, the dull thud of exhaustion that made her bones feel heavy. Across the street, a couple walked out of a trendy sushi place, laughing over something on their phones. Mia watched them for a moment, their easy smiles and clean clothes a stark reminder of everything she didn't have. She wasn't jealous, not exactly. She'd stopped wishing for that kind of life a long time ago, but it still stung, seeing how effortless it looked for some people, while she was out here, invisible, scraping by on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers. Back in the car, Victor finally put his phone down, leaning his head against the seat with a faint sigh. "Long day," he muttered, more to himself than to Daniel. "These people think they can negotiate with me. Idiots." Daniel nodded absently, keeping his eyes on the road. "Yeah, sounds rough." His voice was neutral, but his mind was still on the girl. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, small and fragile against the towering figure of Victor in his $1,000 suit. It wasn't his place to care. He got paid to drive, not to play conscience. But it gnawed at him anyway. Mia pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them as she stared at the cracked pavement. She replayed the encounter in her head, the man's laugh, his cold green eyes, the way he dismissed her like she was trash. It wasn't the first time someone had treated her that way, but it stuck with her more than usual. There'd been something in his face, a sharpness to his features that tugged at a memory she couldn't quite grab onto. She shook her head, brushing it off as exhaustion playing tricks on her. What did it matter? He was gone, and she was still here, still hungry, still alone. A woman walking her dog paused nearby, her eyes softening as she glanced at Mia. "Hey, sweetie, you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious, like she didn't want to overstep. Mia forced a tight smile, nodding. "I'm fine, thanks." She hated that question, hated the pity that always came with it, but she couldn't afford to snap. Not when the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a $5 bill, holding it out with a hesitant smile. "Get yourself something warm, okay?" the woman said, pressing the money into Mia's hand before hurrying off with her dog. Mia stared at the bill, her throat tightening. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a burger or a coffee, something to quiet the growling in her stomach. She tucked it into her pocket, whispering a quiet thank you to the empty air. She didn't know it yet, but that man in the suit, the one who'd laughed in her face, was about to turn her world upside down. And he didn't have a clue that the girl he'd mocked was the daughter he'd never known he had. Mia clutched the $5 bill in her pocket as she trudged away from the bus bench, the night air cooling her flushed cheeks. The streets of Los Angeles were quieter now, the tourist bustle fading into the hum of late-night traffic and the occasional shout from a bar down the block. She headed toward a 24-hour diner a few streets over, one she'd been to before, a grimy little place with flickering fluorescent lights and a waitress who didn't ask too many questions. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but her mind was somewhere else, replaying the sting of that man's laugh over and over. She didn't know why it bothered her so much. She'd been brushed off plenty of times, yelled at, ignored, even spat on once, but this felt different, personal somehow. She pushed open the diner's door, the bell above it jangling weakly. The smell of greasy fries and burnt coffee hit her like a wave, comforting in its familiarity. She slid into a booth near the back, the vinyl seat cracked and sticky under her jeans. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a messy bun, ambled over with a laminated menu. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy from too many cigarettes. "Just a cheeseburger and water," Mia said, sliding the crumpled bill across the table. "Keep the change." The waitress nodded, pocketing the money without a word, and shuffled off. Mia leaned her head against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep and wouldn't let go. Her life hadn't always been like this, sleeping in alleys, begging for scraps, dodging trouble. She used to have a home, a mom, a bed with a lumpy mattress that smelled like lavender detergent. That was before everything fell apart. Her mom, Elena Torres, had been her whole world. Elena was a freelance journalist, scrappy and determined, always chasing stories that mattered. Corruption in City Hall, workers' rights, stuff no one else cared about. She wasn't rich, far from it. They'd lived in a cramped apartment in East LA, the kind with peeling paint and a stove that only worked half the time. But Elena made it feel like enough. She'd come home late from chasing leads, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and still find the energy to sit with Mia on their sagging couch, reading her stories or helping with homework. "You're smart, Mija," she'd say, tapping Mia's forehead with a grin. "Smarter than me. You're gonna do big things." Mia's throat tightened at the memory. Elena had been everything, tough, funny, warm, but she'd never talked much about Mia's dad. Whenever Mia asked, Elena's face would go tight, her smile fading. "He was someone important," she'd say, her voice clipped. "But he's not here, and we don't need him. It's just you and me, okay?" Mia had stopped asking after a while, figuring he was some deadbeat who'd walked out before she was born. It didn't matter. Elena was enough. Then, 3 years ago, it all unraveled. Elena got sick. Lung cancer, the doctor said, probably from years of stress and cheap apartments with bad ventilation. She fought it hard, kept working even when she could barely stand, but it wasn't enough. Mia was 14 when she sat by her mom's hospital bed, holding her hand as the machines beeped slower and slower. "You're strong, Mia," Elena whispered, her voice barely there. "Don't let anyone tell you different." And then she was gone. Mia's world shattered that day. There was no family to take her in, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Elena had been a lone wolf, estranged from her own parents long before Mia was born. Social services swooped in, dumping Mia into a foster home that smelled like mildew and regret. The couple there didn't care. Too many kids, too little patience. Mia lasted 6 months before she ran. She couldn't take the yelling, the locked fridge, the way they looked at her like she was a burden. She'd rather face the streets than that. Since then, it'd been a grind. She'd bounced between shelters when she could, slept under bridges when she couldn't. She'd learned how to spot the good Samaritans from the creeps, how to stretch $1 into 3 days of food. She'd tried finding work, washing dishes, sweeping floors, but no one wanted to hire a kid with no ID, no address, no clean clothes. So she survived on what she could scrounge, her mom's words echoing in her head. "You're strong, Mia." Most days she believed it. Some days, like today, she wasn't so sure. The waitress dropped the cheeseburger in front of her, the plate clattering against the table. Mia muttered a thanks and took a bite, the warm grease and melted cheese a small comfort. As she ate, her mind drifted back to that man outside the hotel. His sharp green eyes, the way his mouth curled into that cruel smirk, it gnawed at her. She'd seen a lot of faces in her time on the streets, but his stuck with her, like a puzzle piece she couldn't fit. She shook her head, swallowing hard. She was tired, that's all. Tired and hungry and seeing things that weren't there. Outside, the city kept moving. A group of college kids stumbled past the diner, laughing too loud, their backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. Mia watched them through the smudged window, her chest aching with a quiet, familiar longing. She used to dream of college, studying journalism like her mom, writing stories that made people care. Now, she just dreamed of a full stomach and a safe place to sleep. She finished the burger, wiping her hands on her jeans. The diner was nearly empty now, just her and an old guy in the corner nursing a coffee. She pulled her hoodie tighter around her, the fabric thin and worn. She'd head to the park tonight. There was a spot near the fountain where the cops didn't bother her much. It wasn't safe, not really, but it was better than nothing. As she stood to leave, a man walked in, a scruffy guy in his 30s carrying a guitar case. He glanced at her, then did a double take. "Hey, you're that kid from the hotel, right?" he said, his voice rough but kind. "Saw that jerk in the suit give you a hard time. You okay?" Mia froze, caught off guard. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said quickly, edging toward the door. She didn't like attention, didn't trust it. He nodded, slinging the guitar case onto a stool. "Good. Guys like that think they own the world. Don't let it get to you." He tossed a couple bucks on the counter for a coffee and turned away, leaving her to slip out into the night. The air hit her face, cool and sharp, as she started toward the park. Her steps were heavy, her mind a tangle of memories and questions. She didn't know why that man's face wouldn't leave her alone, why it felt like a ghost from a life she couldn't remember. She told herself it was nothing, just another rich guy who didn't care. But deep down, a tiny spark of something flickered, a feeling she couldn't name, a pull she couldn't shake. She had no idea that the man who'd mocked her was more than a stranger. He was her father. A truth buried in a past she'd never been told, and it was about to change everything. Victor Grayson sat in the dimly lit study of his Beverly Hills mansion, the city sprawling out below him like a glittering tapestry. The room was all sleek lines and dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stuffed with leather-bound volumes he'd never read, a massive desk littered with contracts, and a crystal decanter of whiskey that glowed amber in the soft light. He swirled the glass in his hand, the ice clinking faintly as he stared out the window. It had been a hell of a day. Another win, another billion in the bank, but something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, and that irritated him more than he'd admit. He took a sip, the burn of the whiskey grounding him, but his mind kept drifting back to that girl outside the Four Seasons. Her face, thin, dirty, those big hazel eyes staring up at him, kept flashing behind his eyelids every time he blinked. He'd brushed off plenty of beggars before, never giving them a second thought, so why was this one sticking with him? He shook his head, annoyed at himself. She was just some kid, probably high or lazy, looking for a handout. That's what he told himself, anyway. But those eyes, they reminded him of someone. A ghost from a life he'd buried decades ago. He set the glass down harder than he meant to, the sound sharp against the quiet. Enough of this. He wasn't the type to get sentimental over street trash. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sophia Carter, his assistant of 15 years. She picked up on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. "Yes, Mr. Grayson." "Sophia, I need you to look into something for me," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "Elena Torres. She was someone I knew a long time ago. Find out what happened to her." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for him to notice. "Elena Torres?" Sophia repeated, a faint edge of curiosity in her tone. "Any specific reason, sir?" "Just do it," he snapped, then softened his voice. I don't know, something's bugging me. Call it a hunch. Understood. I'll have answers by morning. She hung up, efficient as always. Victor trusted her. Sophia was sharp, discreet, and didn't waste time with questions he didn't want to answer. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Elena Torres. He hadn't thought about her in years, decades even. She'd been a fling back when he was still hustling to get Grace and Media off the ground. A fiery journalist with a laugh that could light up a room. They'd had something for a few months, but he'd walked away. Ambition trumped everything back then, and she'd been a distraction he couldn't afford. He figured she'd moved on, same as him. End of story. The next morning, Sophia showed up at the mansion, her tablet tucked under her arm and a thin file in her hand. She looked polished as ever, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, navy blazer crisp against her frame, but there was something in her eyes that made Victor sit up straighter. "You found something," he said, skipping the pleasantries as she stepped into the study. She nodded, setting the file on his desk. Elena Torres died 3 years ago, lung cancer. She was 42. Her voice was steady, but she watched him closely, gauging his reaction. Victor's jaw tightened, but he kept his face blank. "That's it?" "No." Sophia tapped the tablet, pulling up a photo. It was Elena, younger than he remembered, holding a baby with dark hair and those same hazel eyes that had haunted him last night. She had a daughter, Mia Torres, 17 now, no father listed on the birth certificate, but the timeline, she hesitated, then met his gaze. "Sir, based on when you knew Elena, there's a strong chance Mia's yours." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at the photo, his mind racing to catch up. Mia, the girl from the hotel, those eyes, they weren't just familiar, they were his. He'd seen them in the mirror every damn day. His stomach churned, the whiskey from last night threatening to come back up. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "As sure as I can be without a DNA test," Sophia said, sliding the file toward him. "After Elena died, Mia went into foster care. She ran away a year later. No permanent address, no school records. She's been off the grid. From what I could dig up, she's been living on the streets ever since." Victor flipped open the file, his hands moving on autopilot. There wasn't much, just a few grainy photos, a death certificate for Elena, some old articles she'd written, but it was enough. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the pieces clicked into place. That girl he'd laughed at, the one he'd told to go earn her own way, she was his daughter, his own flesh and blood, out there starving while he sat in this mansion sipping $100 whiskey. The irony was so thick it choked him. "Why didn't Elena tell me?" he muttered, more to himself than to Sophia. She shrugged, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe she tried. You were on your way up back then, hard to reach, harder to pin down. Or maybe she didn't want you to know. Either way, she raised Mia alone. From what I found, they struggled. A lot." Victor's chest tightened, a mix of guilt and anger swirling inside him. He'd walked away from Elena without a backward glance, assuming she'd be fine. She was tough, smart. He figured she'd land on her feet. He'd never imagined a kid, never thought about what his leaving might have cost her. And now Mia was out there, dirty and desperate, because of him, because he'd been too selfish to care. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The city sparkled below, mocking him with its beauty. "Find her," he said, his voice low and hard. "I don't care what it takes. I need to see her." Sophia raised an eyebrow, but she didn't argue. "It won't be easy. She's a ghost. No phone, no fixed location. I'll start with the shelters, the spots where kids like her hang out, but..." "Sir," she paused, choosing her words. "What are you planning to do when you find her?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't know. All he could see was Mia's face, the way she'd shrunk back when he laughed, the shame in her eyes. His daughter, his own damn daughter, and he'd treated her like dirt. "Just find her," he said, finally turning back to the window. "That's all I need right now." Sophia nodded and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Victor stood there, alone with the weight of it all. He'd spent his life building an empire, stacking money and power until he thought he was untouchable. But now, staring out at the city he'd conquered, he felt smaller than he ever had. Mia was out there, hungry and lost, because he'd failed her before she was even born. And that laugh, the one he'd thrown in her face, was echoing back at him now, louder than ever, tearing through the walls he'd built around himself. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't even know if he could, but for the first time in years, Victor Grayson cared about something more than his next deal. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Victor Grayson stood by the window of his study, the morning sun spilling across the Los Angeles skyline in streaks of gold and pink. He hadn't slept. The whiskey glass from last night sat untouched on his desk, the ice long melted into a puddle. His mind was a mess, tangled with images of Mia. Those hazel eyes, the way she'd flinched when he laughed at her. His daughter. The word felt foreign, heavy, like it didn't belong to him, but it was true, and the truth was clawing at him, demanding he do something. Sophia had been working non-stop since he'd given her the order to find Mia. She'd called in favors, tapped her network of contacts, shelter workers, street informants, even a PI who owed her one. By noon, she had a lead. "She's been seen at a coffee shop in Skid Row," Sophia said over the phone, her voice clipped but steady. "Does odd jobs for cash, sweeping floors, washing dishes. I've got an address." Victor didn't hesitate. "I'm going," he said, already grabbing his coat, a charcoal gray one that cost more than most people's rent. Sophia tried to protest, suggesting she go instead, but he cut her off. "No, this is mine to fix." He hung up before she could argue, his pulse thudding in his ears. He needed to see Mia, to face her, to say something. He wasn't sure what yet, but sitting around wasn't an option. The drive to Skid Row was a jolt. Daniel navigated the Bentley through streets Victor rarely ventured into. Narrow, gritty, lined with tents and shopping carts piled high with junk. The air smelled of stale smoke and unwashed bodies, a far cry from the polished gleam of Beverly Hills. Victor stared out the window, his jaw tight. He'd always avoided places like this, told himself they weren't his problem. Now, knowing Mia was here, it felt personal. The coffee shop was a hole-in-the-wall joint called Brew Haven, its faded sign peeling above a scratched-up door. Victor stepped out of the car, ignoring Daniel's raised eyebrow, and walked inside. The place was small, half a dozen mismatched tables, a counter stained with coffee rings, and a handful of customers who looked like they'd seen better days. Mia was in the back, sweeping the floor with a broom that was more splinters than bristles. She didn't notice him at first, her head down, her dark hair falling over her face. Victor's chest tightened. She looked so small, so worn out, her hoodie hanging off her like it was swallowing her whole. He cleared his throat and her head snapped up. Those hazel eyes met his, and for a split second, recognition flickered, then hardened into something else. Anger. Fear. She gripped the broom tighter, her knuckles whitening. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp and low, cutting through the hum of the room. A few heads turned, but she didn't care. Victor took a step closer, hands raised like he was approaching something wild. "Mia, I need to talk to you." Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" She glanced around, like she was looking for an exit. "I don't know you, leave me alone." He swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. "I'm Victor Grayson, and I'm your father." The broom clattered to the floor. Mia's face went pale, then flushed red, her breath coming fast. "What?" she whispered, then louder. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I didn't know," Victor said quickly, his voice rough with something he didn't recognize. Panic, maybe. Your mom, Alina, I knew her years ago. We were together and then I left. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know about you until yesterday. Mia stared at him, her fists clenching at her sides. You're lying, she spat. My mom never said anything about you, and you, she laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. You're the guy who laughed at me, told me to earn my own way, and now you're my dad? That's some bullshit. I'm not lying, Victor said, stepping closer. She backed up, hitting the wall, and he stopped. I messed up, Mia. I didn't know who you were when I saw you. If I had, you'd what? She cut in, her voice rising. Given me $1 out of pity? Taken me home to your fancy house? Don't act like you care now. You looked at me like I was nothing. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, furious. I don't need you. I don't want your money or your excuses. Get out. The words hit him harder than he expected. He'd faced down boardrooms full of sharks, stared down lawsuits and scandals, but this skinny, furious girl was undoing him. Mia, please, he said, softer now. I'm not here to buy you off. I just want to make this right. There's nothing to make right, she shouted, drawing every eye in the place. You weren't there when my mom was dying. You weren't there when I had to run from foster homes, when I was sleeping in the damn rain. Where were you then, huh? Living it up while we were starving? She grabbed the broom and threw it down again, the crash echoing. Get out. Victor stood there, frozen, as she stormed past him toward the back door. He wanted to follow, to grab her arm and make her listen, but his feet wouldn't move. The weight of her words pinned him in place. She was right. He hadn't been there. He'd left Elena, left her to raise a kid alone, and now that kid hated him. He'd failed her long before he'd laughed in her face. Daniel appeared at his side, his voice low. Boss, maybe give her some space. She's not ready. Victor nodded, barely hearing him. He turned and walked out, the coffee shop door slamming shut behind him. The air outside felt thick, suffocating. He climbed into the Bentley, staring at his hands. Hands that had signed billion-dollar deals but couldn't fix this. Take me home, he muttered, and Daniel didn't say a word. Meanwhile, Mia stumbled into the alley behind the shop, her chest heaving. She slid down against the wall, burying her face in her knees. Her father. That cold, smug bastard was her father. It didn't make sense. Her mom had never hinted at anything like this. But those eyes, that sharp jaw, she couldn't unsee it now. He was part of her, and that made her sick. She wasn't alone for long. Carlos, a wiry guy she'd met on the streets a few times, poked his head out the back door. He was older, maybe 25, with a faded jacket and a knack for showing up when she needed someone to vent to. Hey kid, you okay? He asked, crouching beside her. Saw that whole thing go down? Guy in the suit's your dad? Mia wiped her face, nodding. Yeah, apparently. Carlos whistled low. That's messed up. What's he want? To make it right, she said, mimicking Victor's tone, like he can just waltz in and fix everything. Carlos lit a cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke. Maybe he can. But family's rare out here, Mia. I'd kill for a chance at what you've got. Even if he's a dick, he's still blood. Think about it. She glared at him, but his words sank in, stirring something she didn't want to feel. She'd been alone so long, fighting for every scrap, that the idea of someone, anyone, wanting her felt alien. But trust him? After everything? She couldn't. Not yet. I don't know, she muttered, pulling her hoodie tighter. I don't know. Carlos shrugged, standing up. Your call, kid. Just don't let pride screw you out of something good. He walked off, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Angry, confused, and buried deep, a flicker of hope she hated herself for feeling. A week later, Mia stood in Griffith Park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. She'd picked this spot, neutral ground, far from Victor's glitzy world and her grimy streets. Her hands fidgeted in her pockets, the crumpled business card he'd given her now worn at the edges from days of indecision. She'd called him yesterday, her voice shaking as she'd agreed to meet. Just to talk, no promises. Victor arrived alone. No Bentley, no driver, just him in a plain black coat, looking less like a media mogul and more like a man unsure of his footing. He stopped a few feet away, his green eyes searching her face. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice quieter than she'd expected. Mia crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "I'm here for me, not you. Say what you need to say." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "I'm sorry, Mia. For leaving your mom? For not knowing you existed? For that night at the hotel? I was an ass. I can't change the past. But I want to be here now. Come live with me. Not for money, but because I want to be your dad. If you'll let me." Her chest tightened. She wanted to yell, to run, but his words cracked something open inside her. After a long silence, she said, "Fine, but I'm not some charity case. I want to learn journalism, like Mom. I'll make my own way." Victor's face softened, a faint smile breaking through. "Deal." As they started to walk, Sophia called. "Found an old article from Elena," she said. "She tried contacting you when Mia was 2. Your manager blocked her." Victor froze, guilt crashing over him anew. Mia saw it in his eyes and knew this wasn't over. But for now, they'd try.